Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Emma by Jane Austen. Before we begin, just another quick reminder that if you are interested in submitting questions for the Q&A episode set to release on January the 1st, please feel free to do so in the comments to this or any other of the channel's videos. I would be delighted to present topics during that Q&A that I know people are interested in. So if you are interested in learning more about me, the channel, or anything else that happens to come up in the questions, please do drop in on January 1st and see that video, which will be inspired by First We Feast's Hot Ones series. So, even if you're not interested in the questions, please feel free to stop by. I'm sure that the sight of me in extreme agony, trying my best to remain calm and quiet, will be engaging, if nothing else. So thank you very much to those who have already submitted questions, and those of you who wish to do so. I really appreciate it. Now, when last we left Emma, she and the social set were taking a tour of Donwell Abbey, the residence of Mr. Knightley, and there was an odd exchange in which Jane Fairfax mysteriously left early and Mr. Frank Churchill mysteriously arrived late. It is supposed by us, the reader, that there might be something that connects these two events, but I don't know whether the characters have brought that up amongst themselves. This week in the book is a full one for the social calendar, for just after the journey to Donwell Abbey, which took place on a beautiful day where people went and walked the gardens and lanes surrounding the abbey. The next day is the trip to Box Hill, one which has been even more highly anticipated. So let's dive right in with chapter 43 of Emma. They had a very fine day for Box Hill, and all the other outward circumstances of arrangement, accommodation, and punctuality were in favour of a pleasant party. Mr. Weston directed the whole, officiating safely between Hartfield and the vicarage, and everybody was in good time. Emma and Harriet went together, Miss Bates and her niece with the Eltons, the gentleman on horseback. Mrs. Weston remained with Mr. Woodhouse. Nothing was wanting but to be happy when they got there. 7 miles were travelled in expectation of enjoyment, and everybody had a burst of admiration on first arriving. But in the general amount of the day, there was deficiency. There was a languor, a want of spirits, a want of union, which could not be got over. They separated too much into parties. The Eltons walked together. Mr. Knightley took charge of Miss Bates and Jane, and Emma and Harriet belonged to Frank Churchill. And Mr. Weston tried, in vain, to make them harmonize better. It seemed at first an accidental division, but it never materially varied. Mr. and Mrs. Elton, indeed, showed no unwillingness to mix and be as agreeable as they could. But during the whole 2 hours that were spent on the hill, there seemed a principle of separation between the other parties, too strong for any fine prospects, or any cold collation, or any cheerful Mr. Weston to remove. At first it was downright dullness to Emma. She had never seen Frank Churchill so silent and stupid. He said nothing worth hearing, looked without seeing, admired without intelligence, listened without knowing what she said. While he was so dull, it was no wonder that Harriet should be dull likewise, and they were both insufferable. It has just begun to rain outside, which seems to echo the mood of the party that we're experiencing in Emma quite well. When they all sat down, it was better, to her taste a great deal better, for Frank Churchill grew talkative and gay, making her his first object. Every distinguishing attention that could be paid was paid to her. To amuse her and be agreeable in her eyes seemed all that he cared for. And Emma, glad to be enlivened, not sorry to be flattered, was gay and easy too, and gave him all the friendly encouragement, the admission to be gallant, which she had ever given in the first and most animating period of their acquaintance, but which now, in her own estimation, meant nothing, though in the judgment of most people looking on it, must have had such an appearance as no English word but flirtation could very well describe. Mr. Frank Churchill and Miss Woodhouse flirted together excessively. They were laying themselves open to that very phrase, and to having it sent off in a letter to Maple Grove by one lady, to Ireland by another. Not that Emma was gay and thoughtless from any real felicity. It was rather because she felt less happy than she expected. She laughed because she was disappointed, and though she liked him for his attentions, and thought them all, whether in friendship, admiration, or playfulness, extremely judicious, they were not winning back her heart. She still intended him for her friend. "How much I am obliged to you," said he, "for telling me to come this day. If it had not been for you, I should certainly have lost all the happiness of this party. I had quite determined to go away again." "Yes, you were very cross, and I do not know what about, except that you were too late for the best strawberries. I was a kinder friend than you deserved, but you were humble. You begged hard to be commanded to come." "Oh, don't say I was cross. I was fatigued. The heat overcame me." "It is hotter today." "Not to my feelings. I am perfectly comfortable today." "You are comfortable because you are under command." "Your command? Yes?" "Perhaps I intended you to say so, but I meant self-command. You had, somehow or other, broken bounds yesterday, and run away from your own management. But today you are got back again. And as I cannot be always with you, it is best to believe your temper under your own command, rather than mine." "It comes to the same thing. I can have no self-command without a motive. You order me, whether you speak it or not. And you can always be with me. You are always with me. Dating from 3 o'clock yesterday. My perpetual influence could not begin earlier, or you would not have been so much out of humour yesterday. 3 o'clock yesterday. That is your date? I thought I had seen you first in February. Your gallantry is really unanswerable. But, and she lowered her voice, nobody speaks except ourselves, and it is rather too much to be talking nonsense for the entertainment of 7 silent people. I say nothing of which I am ashamed, replied he with lively impudence. I saw you first in February. Let everybody on the hill hear me, if they can. Let my accents swell to Mickleham on one side, and Dorking on the other. I saw you first in February. And then, whispering, our companions are excessively stupid. What shall we do to rouse them? Any nonsense will serve. They shall talk. Ladies and gentlemen, I am ordered by Miss Woodhouse, who, wherever she is, presides, to say that she desires to know what you are all thinking of. Some laughed and answered good-humouredly. Miss Bates said a great deal. Mrs. Elton swelled at the idea of Miss Woodhouse's presiding. Mr. Knightley's answer was the most direct. Is Miss Woodhouse sure that she would like to hear what we are all thinking of? Oh, no, no, cried Emma, laughing as carelessly as she could. Upon no account in the world. It's the very last thing I would stand the brunt of just now. Let me hear anything rather than what you are all thinking of. I will not say quite all. There are 1 or 2, perhaps, glancing at Mr. Weston and Harriet, whose thoughts I might not be afraid of knowing. It is a sort of thing, cried Mrs. Elton emphatically, which I should not have thought myself privileged to inquire into, though perhaps, as the chaperone of the party, I never was in any circle, exploring parties, young ladies, married women. Her mutterings were chiefly to her husband, and he murmured in reply, Very true, my love, very true. Exactly so, indeed, quite unheard of. But some ladies say anything. Better pass it off as a joke. Everybody knows what is due to you. It will not do, whispered Frank to Emma. They are most of them affronted. I will attack them with more address. Ladies and gentlemen, I am ordered by Miss Woodhouse to say that she waives her right of knowing exactly what you may all be thinking of, and only requires something very entertaining from each of you, in a general way. Here are 7 of you besides myself, who, she is pleased to say, am very entertaining already. And she only demands from each of you either one thing very clever, be it prose or verse, original or repeated, or 2 things, moderately clever, or 3 things very dull indeed, and she engages to laugh heartily at them all. Oh, very well, exclaimed Miss Bates. Then I need not be uneasy. 3 things very dull indeed. That will just do for me, you know. I am sure to say 3 dull things as soon as I ever open my mouth, shan't I? Looking round with most good-humoured dependence on everybody's assent. Do you all think I shall? Emma could not resist. Ah, ma'am, but there may be a difficulty. Pardon me, but you will be limited as to number. Only 3 at once. Miss Bates, deceived by the mock ceremony of her manner, did not immediately catch her meaning. but when it burst on her, it could not anger, though a slight blush showed that it could pain her. "Ah, well, to be sure. Yes, I see what she means." Turning to Mr. Knightley, "And I will try to hold my tongue. I must make myself very disagreeable, or she would not have said such a thing to an old friend." "I like your plan," cried Mr. Weston. "Agreed, agreed. I will do my best. I am making a conundrum. How will a conundrum reckon?" "Low, I am afraid, sir, very low," answered his son, "but we shall be indulgent, especially to anyone who leads the way." "No, no," said Emma, "it will not reckon low. A conundrum of Mr. Weston shall clear him and his next neighbour. Come, sir, pray let me hear it." "I doubt its being very clever myself," said Mr. Weston. "It is too much a matter of fact, but here it is. What 2 letters of the alphabet are there that express perfection?" "What 2 letters express perfection? I am sure I do not know." "Ah, you will never guess. You," to Emma, "I am certain will never guess. I will tell you. M and A. M-A. Do you understand?" Understanding and gratification came together. It might be a very indifferent piece of wit, but Emma found a great deal to laugh at and enjoy in it, and so did Frank and Harriet. It did not seem to touch the rest of the party equally. Some looked very stupid about it, and Mr. Knightley gravely said, "This explains the sort of clever thing that is wanted, and Mr. Weston has done very well for himself, but he must have knocked up everybody else. Perfection should not come so soon." "Oh, for myself, I protest I must be excused," said Mrs. Elton. "I really cannot attempt. I'm not at all fond of the sort of thing. I had an acrostic once sent to me upon my own name, which I was not at all pleased with. I knew who it came from, an abominable puppy. You know who I mean," nodding to her husband. "These kinds of things are very well at Christmas, when one is sitting round the fire, but quite out of place, in my opinion, when one is exploring about the country in summer. Miss Woodhouse must excuse me. I am not one of those who have witty things at everybody's service. I do not pretend to be a wit. I have a great deal of vivacity in my own way, but I really must be allowed to judge when to speak and when to hold my tongue. Pass us, if you please, Mr. Churchill. Pass Mr. E., Knightley, Jane, and myself. We have nothing clever to say. Not one of us." "Yes, yes, pray pass me," added her husband, with a sort of sneering consciousness. "I have nothing to say that can entertain Miss Woodhouse or any other young lady. An old married man, quite good for nothing. Shall we walk, Augusta?" "With all my heart. I'm really tired of exploring so long on one spot. Come, Jane, take my other arm." Jane declined it, however, and the husband and wife walked off. "Happy couple," said Frank Churchill, as soon as they were out of hearing. "How well they suit one another. Very lucky, marrying as they did, upon an acquaintance formed only in a public place. They only knew each other, I think, for a few weeks in Bath. Peculiarly lucky. For as to any real knowledge of a person's disposition that Bath or any public place can give, it's all nothing. There can be no knowledge. It is only by seeing women in their own homes, among their own set, just as they always are, that you can form any just judgment. Short of that, it's all guess and luck, and generally will be ill luck. How many a man has committed himself on short acquaintance and rued it all the rest of his life. Miss Fairfax, who had seldom spoken before except among her own confederates, spoke now. "Such things do occur, undoubtedly." She was stopped by a cough. Frank Churchill turned towards her to listen. "You were speaking," said he gravely. She recovered her voice. "I was only going to observe that though such unfortunate circumstances do sometimes occur both to men and women, I cannot imagine them to be very frequent. A hasty and imprudent attachment may arise, but there is generally time to recover from it afterwards. I would be understood to mean that it can be only weak, irresolute characters, whose happiness must always be at the mercy of chance, who will suffer an unfortunate acquaintance to be an inconvenience, an oppression, forever." He made no answer, merely looked and bowed in submission, and soon afterwards said, in a lively tone, "Well, I have so little confidence in my own judgment that whenever I marry, I hope somebody will choose my wife for me. Will you?" turning to Emma, "will you choose a wife for me? I am sure I should like anybody fixed on by you. You provide for the family, you know," with a smile at his father. "Find somebody for me. I'm in no hurry. Adopt her, educate her, and make her like myself. By all means, if you can." "Very well. I undertake the commission. You shall have a charming wife." "She must be very lively and have hazel eyes. I care for nothing else. I shall go abroad for a couple of years, and when I return, I shall come to you for my wife. Remember." Emma was in no danger of forgetting. It was a commission to touch every favourite feeling. Would not Harriet be the very creature described? Hazel eyes accepted, 2 years more might make her all that he wished. He might even have Harriet in his thoughts at the moment. Who could say? Referring the education to her seemed to imply it. "Now, ma'am," said Jane to her aunt, "shall we join Mrs. Elton?" "If you please, my dear, with all my heart. I am quite ready. I was ready to have gone with her, but this will do just as well. We shall soon overtake her. There she is. No, that's somebody else. That's one of the ladies in the Irish car party. Not at all like her. Well, I declare." They walked off, followed in half a minute by Mr. Knightley. Mr. Weston, his son, Emma, and Harriet only remained, and the young man's spirits now rose to a pitch almost unpleasant. Even Emma grew tired at last of flattery and merriment, and wished herself rather walking quietly about with any of the others, or sitting almost alone and quite unattended to, in tranquil observation of the beautiful views beneath her. The appearance of the servants, looking out for them to give notice of the carriages, was a joyful sight, and even the bustle of collecting and preparing to depart, and the solicitude of Mrs. Elton to have her carriage first, were gladly endured, in the prospect of the quiet drive home, which was to close the very questionable enjoyments of this day of pleasure. Such another scheme, composed of so many ill-assorted people, she hoped never to be betrayed into again. While waiting for the carriage, she found Mr. Knightley by her side. He looked around as if to see that no one were near, and then said, "Emma, I must once more to you speak as I have been used to do. A privilege rather endured than allowed, perhaps, but I must still use it. I cannot see you acting wrong without a remonstrance. How could you be so unfeeling to Miss Bates? How could you be so insolent in your wit to a woman of her character, age, and situation? Emma, I had not thought it possible. Emma recollected, blushed, was sorry, but tried to laugh it off. Nay, how could I help saying what I did? Nobody could have helped it. It was not so very bad. I dare say she did not understand me. I assure you, she did. She felt your full meaning. She has talked of it since. I wish you could have heard how she talked of it, with what candour and generosity. I wish you could have heard her honouring your forbearance in being able to pay her such attentions, as she was for ever receiving from yourself and your father, when her society must be so irksome. Oh, cried Emma, I know there is not a better creature in the world, but you must allow that what is good and what is ridiculous are most unfortunately blended in her. They are blended, he said, I acknowledge, and were she prosperous, I could allow much for the occasional prevalence of the ridiculous over the good. Were she a woman of fortune, I would leave every harmless absurdity to take its chance. I would not quarrel with you for any liberties of manner. Were she your equal in situation? But, Emma, consider how far this is from being the case. She is poor. She has sunk from the comforts she was born to, and if she lived to old age must probably sink more. Her situation should secure your compassion. It was badly done indeed. You, whom she had known from an infant, whom she had seen grow up from a period when her notice was an honour, to have you now, in thoughtless spirits and the pride of a moment, laugh at her, humble her, and before her niece too, and before others, many of whom, certainly some, would be entirely guided by your treatment of her. This was not pleasant to you, Emma, and it is very far from pleasant to me, but I must. I will tell you truths when all I can, satisfied with proving myself your friend by very faithful counsel, and trusting that you will, some time or other, do me greater justice than you can do now. While they talked, they were advancing towards the carriage. It was ready, and before she could speak again, he had handed her in. He had misinterpreted the feelings which had kept her face averted and her tongue motionless. They were combined only of anger against herself, mortification, and deep concern. She had not been able to speak, and on entering the carriage sunk back for a moment, overcome. Then reproaching herself for having taken no leave, making no acknowledgment, parting in apparent sullenness. She looked out with a voice and hand eager to show a difference, but it was just too late. He had turned away, and the horses were in motion. She continued to look back, but in vain, and soon, with what appeared unusual speed, they were halfway down the hill, and everything left far behind. She was vexed beyond what could have been expressed, almost beyond what she could conceal. Never had she felt so agitated, mortified, grieved, at any circumstance in her life. She was most forcibly struck. The truth of his representation there was no denying. She felt it at her heart. How could she have been so brutal, so cruel to Miss Bates? How could she have exposed herself to such ill opinion? in anyone she valued, and how suffer him to leave her without saying one word of gratitude, of concurrence, of common kindness. Time did not compose her. As she reflected more, she seemed but to feel it more. She never had been so depressed. Happily, it was not necessary to speak. There was only Harriet, who seemed not in spirits herself, fagged, and very willing to be silent. And Emma felt the tears running down her cheeks almost all the way home, without being at any trouble to check them, extraordinary as they were. Chapter 44. The wretchedness of a scheme to Box Hill was in Emma's thoughts all the evening. How it might be considered by the rest of the party she could not tell. They, in their different homes and their different ways, might be looking back on it with pleasure. But in her view it was a morning more completely misspent, more totally bare of rational satisfaction at the time, and more to be abhorred in recollection than any she had ever passed. A whole evening of backgammon with her father was felicity to it. There, indeed, lay real pleasure, for there she was giving up the sweetest hours of the 24 to his comfort, and feeling that, unmerited as might be the degree of his fond affection and confiding esteem, she could not, in her general conduct, be open to any severe reproach. As a daughter, she hoped she was not without a heart. She hoped no one could have said to her, "How could you be so unfeeling to your father?" I will tell you the truths while I can. Miss Bates should never again, no, never. If attention in future could do away the past, she might hope to be forgiven. She had been often remiss, her conscience told her so. Remiss, perhaps, more in thought than fact, scornful, ungracious, but it should be so no more. In the warmth of true contrition she would call upon her the very next morning, and it should be the beginning, on her side, of a regular, equal, kindly intercourse. She was just as determined when the morrow came, and went early, that nothing might prevent her. It was not unlikely, she thought, that she might see Mr. Knightley on her way, or perhaps he might come in while she were paying her visit. She had no objection. She would not be ashamed of the appearance of the penitence, so justly and truly hers. Her eyes were towards Donwell as she walked, but she saw him not. The ladies were all at home. She had never rejoiced at the sound before, nor ever before entering the passage, nor walking up the stairs, with any wish of giving pleasure, but in conferring obligation, or of deriving it, except in the subsequent ridicule. There was a bustle on her approach, a good deal of moving and talking. She heard Miss Bates's voice. Something was to be done in a hurry. The maid looked frightened and awkward, hoped she would be pleased to wait a moment, and then ushered her in too soon. The aunt and niece seemed both escaping into the adjoining room. Jane she had a distinct glimpse of, looking extremely ill, and before the door had shut them out, she heard Miss Bates saying, "Well, my dear, I say, you are to be laid down upon the bed, and I am sure you are ill enough." Poor old Mrs. Bates, civil and humble as usual, looked as if she did not quite understand what was going on. "I am afraid Jane is not very well," said she, "but I do not know. They tell me she is well, I dare say my daughter will be here presently, Miss Woodhouse. I hope you find a chair. I wish Hetty had not gone. I'm very little able. Have you a chair, ma'am? Do you sit where you like? I'm sure she will be here presently. Emma seriously hoped she would. She had a moment's fear of Miss Bates keeping away from her. But Miss Bates soon came, very happy and obliged. But Emma's conscience told her that there was not the same cheerful volubility as before, less ease of look and manner. A very friendly inquiry after Miss Fairfax, she hoped, might lead the way to a return of old feelings. The touch seemed immediate. "Ah, Miss Woodhouse, how kind you are! I suppose you've heard, and are come to give us joy. This does not seem much like joy, indeed, in me," twinkling away a tear or two. "But it will be very trying for us to part with her, after having had her so long. And she has a dreadful headache just now, writing all the morning. Such long letters, you know, to be written to Colonel Campbell and Mrs. Dixon." "My dear," said I, "you'll blind yourself." For tears were in her eyes perpetually. "One cannot wonder, cannot wonder. It is such a change, and I thought she is amazingly fortunate. Such a situation, I suppose, as no young woman before ever met with on first going out. Do not think us ungrateful, Miss Woodhouse, for such surprising good fortune," again dispersing her tears. "But, poor dear soul, if you were to see what a headache she has! When one is in great pain, you cannot know any blessing quite as it may deserve. She is as low as possible. To look at her, nobody would think how delighted and happy she is to have secured such a situation. You will excuse her not coming to you. She is not able. She has gone to her own room. I want her to lie down upon her bed." "My dear," said I shall say you are laid down upon your bed. But, however, she is not. She is walking about the room. But now that she has written her letters, she says she shall soon be well. She will be extremely sorry to miss seeing you, Miss Woodhouse, but your kindness will excuse her. You were kept waiting at the door. I was quite ashamed, but somehow there was a little bustle, for it so happened that we had not heard the knock. Until you were on the stairs, we did not know anybody was coming. It's only Mrs. Cole, said I, depend upon it. Nobody else would come so early. Well, she said, it must be born some time or other, and it may as well be now. But then Patty came in and said it was you. Oh, said I, it is Miss Woodhouse. I am sure you will like to see her. I can see nobody, said she, and up she got and would go away, and that was what made us keep you waiting. I am extremely sorry and ashamed we were. If you must go, my dear, said I, you must, and I will say you are laid down upon the bed. Emma was most sincerely interested. Her heart had long been growing kinder towards Jane, and this picture of her present sufferings acted as a cure for any former ungenerous spirit, and left her nothing but pity. And the remembrance of the less just and less gentle sensations of the past obliged her to admit that Jane might very naturally resolve on seeing Mrs. Cole or any other steady friend, when she might not bear to see herself. She spoke as she felt, with earnest regret and solicitude, sincerely wishing that the circumstances which she collected from Miss Bates to be now actually determined on might be as much for Miss Fairfax's advantage and comfort as possible. It must be a severe trial to them all. She had understood it was to be delayed till Colonel Campbell's return. So very kind, replied Miss Bates. But you are always kind. There was no bearing such an always, and to break through her dreadful gratitude, Emma made the direct inquiry of, "Where, may I ask, is Miss Fairfax going?" "To a Mrs. Smallridge, charming woman, most superior, to have the charge of her 3 little girls, delightful children. Impossible that any situation could be more replete with comfort, if we except, perhaps, Mrs. Suckling's own family, and Mrs. Bragg's. But Mrs. Smallridge isn't intimate with both, and in the very same neighbourhood, lives only 4 miles from Maple Grove. Jane will be only 4 miles from Maple Grove. Mrs. Elton, I suppose, has been the person to whom Miss Fairfax owes... Yes, our good Mrs. Elton, the most indefatigable, true friend. She would not take a denial. She would not let Jane say no, for when Jane first heard of it, it was the day before yesterday, the very morning we were at Donwell. When Jane first heard of it, she was quite decided against accepting the offer, and for the reasons you mention, exactly as you say, she had made up her mind to close with nothing till Colonel Campbell's return, and nothing should induce her to enter into any engagement at present. And so she told Mrs. Elton over and over again, and I am sure I had no more idea that she would change her mind. But that good Mrs. Elton, whose judgment never fails her, saw farther than I did. It is not everybody that would have stood out in such a kind way as she did and refused to take Jane's answer, but she positively declared she would not write any such denial yesterday as Jane wished her. She would wait. And sure enough, yesterday evening it was all settled that Jane should go. Quite a surprise to me. I had not the least idea. Jane took Mrs. Elton aside and told her at once that upon thinking over the advantages of Mr. Suckling's situation, she had come to the resolution of accepting it. I did not know a word of it till it was all settled. You spent the evening with Mrs. Elton? Oh, yes. All of us. Mrs. Elton would have us come. It was settled so upon the hill whilst we were walking about with Mr. Knightley. You must all spend your evening with us, she said. Positively, must have you all come. Mr. Knightley was there too, was he? No, not Mr. Knightley. He declined it from the first, and though I thought he would come, because Mrs. Elton declared she would not let him off, he did not. But my mother and Jane and I were all there, and a very agreeable evening we had. Such kind friends, you know, Miss Woodhouse, one must always find agreeable, though everybody seemed rather fagged after the morning's party. Even pleasure, you know, is fatiguing, and I cannot say that any of them seemed very much to have enjoyed it. However, I shall always think it a very pleasant party, and feel extremely obliged to the kind friends who included me in it. Miss Fairfax, I suppose, though you were not aware of it, had been making up her mind the whole day. I dare say she had. Whenever the time may come, it must be unwelcome to her and all her friends, but I hope her engagement will have every elevation that is possible. I mean, as to the character and manners of the family. Oh, thank you, dear Miss Woodhouse. Yes, indeed, there is everything in the world that can make her happy in it. Except the Sucklings and Braggies, there is no such another establishment, so liberal and elegant, in all Mrs. Elton's acquaintance. Mrs. Smallridge, a most delightful woman, a style of living almost equal to Maple Grove, and as to the children, except the little Sucklings and the little Braggies, there are not such elegant, sweet children anywhere. Jane will be treated with such regard and kindness. It will be nothing but pleasure, a life of pleasure. And her salary, I really cannot venture to name her salary to you, Miss Woodhouse. Even you, used as you are to great sums, would hardly believe that so much could be given to a young person like Jane. Ah, madam, cried Emma, if other children are at all like what I remember to have been myself, I should think 5 times the amount of what I have ever yet heard named as a salary on such occasions, dearly earned. You are so noble in your ideas. And when is Miss Fairfax to leave you? Very soon indeed. That's the worst of it. Within a fortnight. Mrs. Smallridge is in a great hurry. My poor mother does not know how to bear it. So then I try to put it out of her thoughts and say, come, ma'am, do not let us think about it any more. Her friends must all be sorry to lose her, and will not Colonel and Mrs. Campbell be sorry to find that she has engaged herself before their return? Yes, Jane says she is sure they will, but yet this is such a situation as she cannot feel herself justified in declining. I was so astonished when she first told me what she had been saying to Mrs. Elton, and what Mrs. Elton at the same moment came congratulating me upon it. It was before tea. Stay, no. No, it could not be before tea, because we were just going to cards. And yet it was before tea, because I remember thinking, oh, no, now I recollect, now I have it. Something happened before tea, but not that. Mr. Elton was called out of the room before tea. Old John Abdy's son wanted to speak with him. Poor old John, I have a great regard for him. He was a clerk to my poor father 27 years. And now, poor old man, he's bedridden, and very poorly with the rheumatic gout in his joints. I must go and see him today, and so will Jane, I'm sure, if she gets out at all. And poor John's son came to talk to Mr. Elton about relief from the parish. He is very well to do himself, you know, being head man at the Crown, ostler, and everything of that sort. But still he cannot keep his father without some help. And so when Mr. Elton came back, he told us what John Ostler had been telling him. And then it came out all about the chaise having been sent to Randalls to take Mr. Frank Churchill to Richmond. That was what happened before tea. It was after tea that Jane spoke to Mrs. Elton. Miss Bates would hardly give Emma time to say how perfectly this new circumstance was to her, but as without supposing it possible that she could be ignorant of any of the particulars of Mr. Frank Churchill's going, she proceeded to give them all. It was of no consequence. What Mr. Elton had learned from the ostler on the subject, being the accumulation of the ostler's own knowledge and the knowledge of the servants at Randalls, was that a messenger had come over from Richmond soon after the return of the party from Box Hill, which messenger, however, had been no more than was expected, and that Mr. Churchill had sent his nephew a few lines, containing, upon the whole, a tolerable account of Mrs. Churchill, and only wishing him not to delay coming back beyond the next morning early, but that Frank Churchill having resolved to go home directly, without waiting at all, and his horse seeming to have a cold, Tom had been sent off immediately for the Crown chaise, and the ostler had stood out and seen it pass by, the boy going at a good pace, and driving very steady. There was nothing in all this either to astonish or interest, and it caught Emma's attention only as it united with the subject which already engaged her mind. The contrast between Mrs. Churchill's importance in the world and Jane Fairfax's struck her. One was everything, the other nothing, and she sat, musing on the difference of women's destiny, and quite unconscious on what her eyes were fixed, till roused by Miss Bates's saying, "Ay, I see what you are thinking of, the pianoforte. What's to become of that?" "Very true. Poor dear Jane was talking of it just now." "You must go," said she. "You and I must part. You will have no business here." "Let it stay, however," said she. "Give it house room till Colonel Campbell comes back. I shall talk about it to him, and he will settle for me. He will help me out of all my difficulties." And to this day I do believe she knows not whether it was his present or his daughter's. Now Emma was obliged to think of the pianoforte, and the remembrance of all her former fanciful and unfair conjectures was so little pleasing that she soon allowed herself to believe her visit had been long enough, and with a repetition of everything that she could venture to say of the good wishes which she really felt, took leave. Chapter 45. Emma's pensive meditations, as she walked home, were not interrupted. But on entering the parlour, she found those who must rouse her. Mr. Knightley and Harriet had arrived during her absence, and were sitting with her father. Mr. Knightley immediately got up, and in a manner decidedly graver than usual, said, "I would not go away without seeing you, but I have no time to spare, and therefore must now be gone directly. I am going to London, to spend a few days with John and Isabella. Have you anything to send or say besides the love which nobody carries?" "Nothing at all. But is not this a sudden scheme?" "Yes. Rather, I have been thinking of it some little time." Emma was sure he had not forgiven her. He looked unlike himself. Time, however, she thought, would tell him that they ought to be friends again. While he stood, as if meaning to go but not going, her father began his inquiries.
"Well, my dear, did you get there safely? And how did you find my worthy old friend and her daughter? I dare say they must have been very much obliged to you for coming. Dear Emma has been to call on Mrs. and Miss Bates, Mr. Knightley, as I told you before. She is always so attentive to them."
Emma's colour was heightened by this unjust praise, and with a smile and shake of the head which spoke much, she looked at Mr. Knightley. It seemed as if there were an instantaneous impression in her favour, as if his eyes received the truth from hers, and all that had passed of good in her feelings were at once caught and honoured. He looked at her with a glow of regard. She was warmly gratified, and in another moment still more so, by a little movement of more than common friendliness on his part. He took her hand. Whether she had not made herself the first motion, she could not say. She might, perhaps, have rather offered it, but he took her hand, pressed it, and certainly was on the point of carrying it to his lips, when, from some fancy or other, he suddenly let it go. Why he should feel such a scruple, why he should change his mind when it was all but done, she could not perceive. He would have judged better, she thought, if he had not stopped. The intention, however, was indubitable, and whether it was that his manners had in general so little gallantry, or however else it happened, but she thought nothing became him more. It was with him, of so simple yet so dignified a nature. She could not but recall the attempt with great satisfaction. It spoke to such perfect amity. He left them immediately afterwards, gone in a moment. He always moved with the alertness of a mind which could neither be undecided nor dilatory, but now he seemed more sudden than usual in his disappearance. Emma could not regret her having gone to Miss Bates, but she wished she had left her 10 minutes earlier. It would have been a great pleasure to talk over Jane Fairfax's situation with Mr. Knightley. Neither would she regret that he would be going to Brunswick Square, for she knew how much his visit would be enjoyed. But it might have happened at a better time, and to have had longer notice of it would have been pleasanter. They parted thorough friends, however. She could not be deceived as to the meaning of his countenance, and his unfinished gallantry. It was all done to assure her that she had been fully recovered his good opinion. He had been sitting with them half an hour, she found. It was a pity that she had not come back earlier. In the hope of diverting her father's thoughts from the disagreeableness of Mr. Knightley's going back to London, and so going so suddenly, and going on horseback, which she knew would be all very bad, Emma communicated her news of Jane Fairfax, and her dependence on the effect was justified. It supplied a very useful check, interested without disturbing him. He had long made up his mind to Jane Fairfax's going out as a governess, and could talk of it cheerfully, but Mr. Knightley's going to London had been an unexpected blow.
"I'm very glad, indeed, my dear, to hear she is to be so comfortably settled. Mrs. Elton is a very good-natured and agreeable and I dare say her acquaintance are just what they ought to be. I hope it is a dry situation, and that her health will be taken good care of. It ought to be your first object, and I am sure poor Miss Taylor's always was with me. You know, my dear, she is going to be to this new lady what Miss Taylor was to us, and I hope she will be better off in one respect, and not so induced to go away after it has been her home so long. The following day brought news from Richmond to throw everything else into the background. An express arrived at Randalls to announce the death of Mrs. Churchill. Though her nephew had had no particular reason to hasten back on her account, she had not lived above 36 hours after his return. A sudden seizure of a different nature from anything foreboded by her general state had carried her off after a short struggle. The great Mrs. Churchill was no more. It was felt as such things must be felt. Everybody had a degree of gravity and sorrow, tenderness toward the departed, solicitude for the surviving friends, and, in a reasonable time, curiosity to know where she would be buried. Goldsmith tells us that when lovely woman stoops to folly, she has nothing to do but to die, and when she stoops to be disagreeable, it is equally to be recommended as a clearer of ill fame. Mrs. Churchill, after being disliked at least 25 years, was now spoken of with compassionate allowances. In one point she was fully justified. She had never been admitted before to be seriously ill. The event acquitted her of all the fancifulness and all the selfishness of imaginary complaints. Poor Mrs. Churchill! No doubt she had been suffering a great deal, more than anybody had ever supposed, and continual pain would try the temper. It was a sad event, a great shock. With all her faults, what would Mr. Churchill do without her? Mr. Churchill's loss would be dreadful indeed. Mr. Churchill would never get over it. Even Mr. Weston shook his head, and looked solemn, and said, "Ah, poor woman, who would have thought it?" and resolved that his mourning should be as handsome as possible, and his wife sat sighing, and moralizing over her broad hems with a commiseration and good sense, true and steady. How it would affect Frank was among the earliest thoughts of both. It was also a very early speculation with Emma. The character of Mrs. Churchill, the grief of her husband, her mind glanced over them both with awe and compassion, and then rested, with lightened feelings, on how Frank might be affected by the event, how benefited, how freed. She saw, in a moment, all the possible good. Now an attachment to Harriet Smith would have nothing to encounter. Mr. Churchill, independent of his wife, was feared by nobody, an easy, guidable man, to be persuaded into anything by his nephew. All that remained to be wished was that the nephew should form the attachment, as, with all her goodwill in the cause, Emma could feel no certainty of its being already formed. Harriet behaved extremely well on the occasion, with great self-command. Whatever she might feel of brighter hope, she betrayed nothing. Emma was gratified to observe such a proof in her of strengthened character, and refrained from any illusion that might endanger its maintenance. They spoke, therefore, of Mrs. Churchill's death with mutual forbearance. Short letters from Frank were received at Randalls,
communicating all that was immediately important of their state and plans. Mr. Churchill was better than should be expected, and their first removal, on the departure of the funeral for Yorkshire, was to be to the house of a very old friend in Windsor, to whom Mr. Churchill had been promising a visit the last 10 years. At present, there was nothing to be done for Harriet. Good wishes for the future were all that could yet be possible on Emma's side. It was a more pressing concern to show the attention to Jane Fairfax, whose prospects were closing, while Harriet's opened, and whose engagements now allowed of no delay in anyone at Highbury, who wished to show her kindness. And with Emma, it was grown into a first wish. She had scarcely a stronger regret than for her past coldness, and the person, whom she had been so many months neglecting, was now the very one on whom she would have lavished every distinction of regard or sympathy. She wanted to be of use to her, wanted to show a value for her society, and testify respect and consideration. She resolved to prevail on her to spend a day at Hartfield. A note was written to urge it. The invitation was refused, and by a verbal message. Miss Fairfax was not well enough to write, and when Mr. Perry called at Hartfield the same morning, it appeared that she was so much indisposed as to have been visited, though against her own consent, by himself, and that she was suffering under severe headaches and a nervous fever, to a degree which made him doubt the possibility of her going to Mrs. Smallridge's at the time proposed. Her health seemed, for the moment, completely deranged, appetite quite gone, and though there were no absolutely alarming symptoms, nothing touching the pulmonary complaint which was the standing apprehension of the family, Mr. Perry was uneasy about her. He thought she had undertaken more than she was equal to, and that she felt it so herself, though she would not own it. Her spirits seemed overcome. Her present home, he could not but observe, was unfavourable to a nervous disorder, confined always to one room. He could have wished it otherwise, and her good aunt, though his very old friend, he must acknowledge to not be the best companion for an invalid of that description. Her care and attention could not be questioned. They were, in fact, only too great. He very much feared that Miss Fairfax derived more evil than good from them. Emma listened with the warmest concern, grieved for her more and more, and looked around, eager to discover some way of being useful. To take her, be it only an hour or two, from her aunt, to give her a change of air and scene, and quiet, rational conversation, even for an hour or two, might do her good. And the following morning she wrote again to say, in the most feeling language she could command, that she would call for her in the carriage at any hour that Jane could name, mentioning that she had Mr. Perry's decided opinion in favour of such an exercise for his patient. The answer was only in this short note: Miss Fairfax's compliments and thanks, but is quite unequal to any exercise. Emma felt that her own note had deserved something better, but it was impossible to quarrel with words whose tremulous inequality showed indisposition so plainly, and she thought only of how she might best counteract this unwillingness to be seen or assisted. In spite of the answer, therefore, she ordered the carriage, and drove to Mrs. Bates's, in the hope that Jane would be induced to join her. But it would not do. Miss Bates came to the carriage door, all gratitude, and agreeing with her most earnestly, and thinking an airing might be of the greatest service, and everything that message could do was tried, but all in vain. Miss Bates was obliged to return without success. Jane was quite unpersuadable. The mere proposal of going out seemed to make her worse. Emma wished she could have seen her, and tried her own powers, but almost before she could hint the wish, Miss Bates made it appear that she had promised her niece on no account to let Miss Woodhouse in. Indeed, the truth was that poor dear Jane could not bear to see anybody at all. Mrs. Elton, indeed, could not be denied, and Mrs. Cole had made such a point, and Mrs. Perry had said so much, but except them, Jane could really see nobody. Emma did not want to be classed with the Mrs. Eltons and the Mrs. Perrys and the Mrs. Coles, who would force themselves anywhere. Neither could she feel any right of preference herself. She submitted, therefore, and only questioned Miss Bates further as to her niece's appetite and diet, which she longed to be able to assist. On that subject, poor Miss Bates was very unhappy, and very communicative. Jane would hardly eat anything. Mr. Perry recommended nourishing food, but everything they could command, and never had anybody such good neighbours. It was distasteful. Emma, on reaching home, called the housekeeper directly to an examination of her stores, and some arrowroot of very superior quality was speedily dispatched to Miss Bates with a most friendly note. In half an hour the arrowroot was returned, with 1,000 thanks from Miss Bates, but dear Jane would not be satisfied without its being sent back. It was a thing she could not take, and moreover she insisted on her saying that she was not at all in want of anything. When Emma afterwards heard that Jane Fairfax had been seen wandering about the meadows at some distance from Highbury, on the afternoon of the very day on which she had, under the plea of being unequal to any exercise, so peremptorily refused to go out with her in the carriage, she could have no doubt, putting everything together, that Jane was resolved to receive no kindness from her. She was sorry, very sorry. Her heart was grieved for a state which seemed but the more pitiable from this sort of irritation of spirits, inconsistency of action, and inequality of powers, and it mortified her that she was given so little credit for proper feeling, or esteemed so little worthy as a friend. But she had the consolation of knowing that her intentions were good, and of being able to say to herself that could Mr. Knightley have been privy to all her attempts of assisting Jane Fairfax, could he even have seen into her heart, he would not, on this occasion, have found anything to reproach. All right, everyone, we will leave it there, with several massive plot twists. The death of Mrs. Churchill, I suppose, could have been foreseen at some point with her continual ill health, though I must confess that I myself thought she might have just been a little hypochondriac. The new news of Jane's leaving the district and going to be a nanny somewhere else is also surprising to me. I confess that I had assumed that she would be sticking around, at least for as long as Frank Churchill could be induced to visit. But it seems that the two things might not be disconnected from one another. The timing of all of these events is, at the very least, suspicious. But what do I know? I am going all on supposition, and have no better information than that which I can glean from these pages. This is the first time I've read Emma, and I am having so much fun. Thank you for joining me this time on Soft Stories. A quick note, the schedule for next week and the week after is going to be a little different than usual. Instead of a Tuesday and Friday upload, I'll be doing 2 Friday uploads instead. One, a Dickens short story on Christmas Day, for that seems appropriate to the season, and on the 1st of January, the Friday following, there will be another video as well, the long-awaited and much talked of Q&A episode. But the 2 Mondays I am going to take for rest, relaxation, and I suspect on the Monday after Christmas, a bit of recovery as well. Thank you so much for your patience during this time, and I hope you all have a marvellous holiday. I will see you on Christmas Day. Thank you so much for joining me for this reading of Emma, and until next we meet, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.